This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 745 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. My prospect models don't incorporate a whole lot from the NFL Combine. They look at height and weight measurements, and there's a weight-adjusted 40 threshold that it wants running backs to hit. But that's it. That's all that I take away from the Combine. With that being said, draft capital is part of my models. You guys know that by now. And draft capital can absolutely be influenced by what happens at the NFL Combine. So I don't think the Combine's useless at all. I think it matters because draft capital matters. So today, I'm going to look at some of the bigger NFL Combine winners and losers. And this is all for fantasy football purposes, of course. Now, before I dig in, I just want to send another reminder about the Late Round Prospect Guide. It launches in less than a week, so make sure you pre-order before the price rises from $11.99 to $14.99. In the guide, you get a breakdown of what goes into my models, and then you'll get profiles of every single running back and wide receiver who were at this year's Combine. Those profiles will give you a breakdown of the type of player that they are, but also pre-draft prospect scores. Once the draft is over, you'll get a new version of the guide to your email with new profiles based on landing spot. There's also an entire section dedicated to my Year 2 model, which analyzes last year's draft class. It'll tell you what to do with players like Kenneth Walker, Dameon Pierce, Alec Pierce, and more. So check it out over on lateround.com. It feels like this conversation has to start with Anthony Richardson. As a lot of you know, I don't have a model for quarterbacks, because prospecting that position is insanely hard, especially when you have to then layer on the fantasy football angle. But the fantasy football angle is incredibly important for a player like Richardson. His passing ability is being questioned, but the rushing ability is not, and it shouldn't. He came in at 6'4", 244 pounds, and he ended up destroying everything at the Combine, including a 40 time of 4.44. For some context, the guy that people like to comp him to is Cam Newton, a physical freak who scored a whole lot of rushing touchdowns in the NFL. Cam Newton was awesome in fantasy. Newton ran a 4.59 40, so Richardson was significantly faster. I mean, Richardson ran his 40-yard dash faster than 3/4 of this year's wide receiver class. And he did it at a much, much bigger size. The man is insane. So we have this freak athlete in Richardson, and scouts are questioning his passing ability. But my stance on this is more game theory based and qualitative. We know rushing is so important in fantasy football at quarterback. A quarterback needs that profile in order to be elite in fantasy. Some of the other quarterbacks in this class have it to a degree, but not like Anthony Richardson. They're not the same type of player. We also know that quarterback evaluation is insanely difficult. I've tried to model it. And while doing so, I've tried to incorporate film grades into it. It's just difficult. We see busts at the position all the time. And a lot of times we just didn't expect that to happen. What we do know is that draft capital is helpful for quarterbacks. I talk about that each year on the quarterback prospect show that I do with Jim Sanas. So my stance with Richardson is this. Pre-draft, we don't know where he's going to go. We don't know where he's going to be drafted. It sounds like it's going to be top 10, but a whole lot of people thought that with Malik Willis last year. And unlike Willis, there are actually good alternatives at quarterback this year for fantasy purposes and real life purposes. So if you're doing your rookie draft before the NFL draft, which some leagues do, you can opt to go with a Bryce Young or a CJ Stroud if you want to play it safe, especially in a super flex league where stability is a little bit more important. But if Richardson ends up getting top 10 draft capital, which right now seems very, very possible, that means the evaluation was there. And that a team sees the ceiling. And that ceiling could legitimately break fantasy football. I can't stress that enough. He's arguably the best athlete that we've ever seen at quarterback come out. So I don't think it would be shocking at all if Richardson is the fantasy football QB1 after the NFL draft. And even if you want to take a chance before the draft, I can at least understand it. Because the game of fantasy football is not the same as the game of real football. Now, as an aside, I think that CJ Stroud was also a winner at the Combine. We all know that entering the Combine, Bryce Young was probably the favorite to be the first quarterback drafted. He still is. But Young didn't throw at the Combine. Stroud did, and he looked great. He's got better size than Young, and his accuracy was evident. Basically, I think this is going to be a very, very interesting next couple of months for this quarterback class. But it's a good one, and it should be good for fantasy. Jackson Smith-Njigba was my model's wide receiver 1 entering the combine. It seemed like the gap was closing from a projected draft capital standpoint before the combine started, and now it seems even likelier to happen. JSN has strong age-adjusted production given what he did as a sophomore, playing alongside Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave at Ohio State. The thing is, because he was playing with those 2 wide receivers, he was pushed to the slot on 89% of his routes run that season. That number courtesy of Pro Football Focus. Now, he didn't run the 40, so we're still not sure what his straight line speed looks like. And he's likely not as fast as Wilson and Olave. But JSN destroyed the 3-cone drill. He's got some of the best agility that we've seen at the position. My stance on JSN is that I do think that a lot of teams could view him as an extremely good slot player, like the best slot receiver that we've seen come out. But if they don't view him as someone who can win on the outside, then he's not likely to see the same type of draft capital as Garrett Wilson or Chris Olave. And that's going to hurt his overall prospect score. And I don't really think this is a Justin Jefferson thing. Justin Jefferson played a whole lot of slot snaps during his final year at LSU. But Jefferson also ran a 4.43 40. He has more speed than JSN has. JSN is more of that like Keenan Allen mold. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that at all. Keenan Allen's been amazing. He's had a great career. Like I've been saying on this show over the last couple of weeks, I almost feel like people think that I'm a JSN hater, which is crazy. He's my wide receiver 1. I would gladly draft him this year. He's got an insane floor given his route running and how well he can work in the slot. I'm just thinking out loud here. As I say all the time, I like to brain vomit on this podcast. I'm thinking about how the draft might go down because that's important. There's obviously a very real and good chance that a talented player like JSN can play the perimeter just fine. It's just that teams don't have tons of evidence of it. And that's going to limit the number of believers out there to increase his draft capital. But overall, it was a winning combine for Jackson Smith-Njigba. To me, partially because of the next guy I'm going to talk about, JSN is the clear wide receiver 1 in this class. So yeah, not only did JSN do really well at the combine, but one of the guys vying for that top wide receiver spot is Jordan Addison, and his combine did not go well. Addison has a thinner build. We knew that going into the combine. You can put on his tape and see that he's thin. But it was definitely reinforced with his weigh-in. He came in at 173 pounds. And now we're back to the whole Devontae Smith BMI argument that we had a couple of years ago. Does BMI matter at wide receiver? Not really. I'm far more concerned about production. Devontae Smith had good production. Marquise Brown, another thinner wide receiver who went in the first round, good production. Jordan Addison, good production. Hollywood Brown and Devontae Smith are productive in the NFL, and it makes plenty of sense to think that Addison will be too. With that being said, Addison isn't as fast as those guys. Devontae Smith ran a sub 4.4 40 at his pro day. Marquise Brown ran a 4.27 at his pro day. Even when you adjust for the fact that pro day times are generally faster, Jordan Addison didn't come close to those times. He ran a 4.49. When you height and weight adjust that time, it's below the 20th percentile. So yeah, there's more concern exiting the combine than there was entering for Addison. He's still my wide receiver too, but I do think that instead of it being close with JSN, that gap just widened. Now we'll go from one wide receiver who disappointed at the combine to one who absolutely destroyed it. Bryce Ford Wheaton was a big winner this past weekend. Ford Wheaton came in at 6'4", 221 pounds. And then he ran the 4th fastest 40 among all wide receivers. He ran a 4.38 40, which is absolutely absurd at his height and weight. That gave him a height-adjusted speed score that wasn't far off of DK Metcalf's. Now, before you get all excited about this, let's be aware of some things. Like I said at the top, combine measurables might matter for draft capital purposes, but wide receivers still need to check a lot of other boxes before we get super excited about them for fantasy purposes. And Ford Wheaton doesn't really check those boxes. He has a well below average best season yards per team pass attempt. And before you start comparing him to DK Metcalf, it's important to know that Metcalf was a whole lot more efficient in college on a per route run basis. The only reason this production profile wasn't better, aside from teammate competition, was because he couldn't stay healthy. Maybe this athleticism ends up translating for Ford Wheaton. But it's not like this is a super unique thing to happen. Maybe we don't see height-adjusted speed scores of 125 like he hit, but we've had plenty of height-adjusted speed scores of 120 since 2011. And the vast majority of those players, when draft capital and production was not there, they ended up failing. Chris Conley, Kevin White, Dorial Green-Beckham, Jazz Ferguson. It's good that this put Ford Wheaton more on the map. But please don't forget that being a good wide receiver is more important than being an athletic human being. Maybe Ford Wheaton surprises, but his production numbers tell us that he's not in the same boat as DK Metcalf or a Julio Jones, or even a Chase Claypool. Marvin Mims is one of my favorite wide receivers in this class, at least from a value perspective. He's not a big receiver at 183 pounds, but he played all over the field at Oklahoma and he generated some monster plays. His average depth of targets were 17, 17.6, and 15.4 during his 3 years in college. That's substantially higher than the average wide receiver. I know that some are concerned that he didn't run a full route tree in college, which is valid, but analytically, he looks great. He had a solid best season yards per team pass attempt rate, and he led Oklahoma in receiving during each of his 3 seasons there. And at the combine, not only did he look smooth and natural catching the football, but he ran a sub 4.40. His top comparable in my model is KJ Hamler, and another one of his comps is actually Jerry Jeudy. But I do think that he has a ceiling of like a Brandon Cooks at the NFL level. Now moving on to running back, as I said in the opening, my running back model looks at a speed score threshold, and that speed score threshold is 90. If a running back doesn't get there, his prospect score gets severely dinged. Kenny McIntosh did not get there, just barely, but he was below the 90 mark. At 204 pounds, McIntosh ran a 4.62, which was the 3rd slowest 40 at the combine at running back. He profiles as a pass catcher at the next level. He had a best season reception share of 12.8%, and his ratio of touches through the air versus on the ground was pretty high. And we've seen profiles like that be okay in the NFL. Alvin Kamara is one of them. He didn't have much rushing production in college, but he had a best season reception share above 18%. Kamara also weighed in 10 pounds heavier than McIntosh and ran a 4.56. So he was just better all around. My model didn't love McIntosh as much as the consensus did to begin with. And now it really doesn't. Since he was so close to that 90 threshold, I can understand giving him a break, but it was not a good combine for him. Now, speaking of Alvin Kamara, one of the top running backs in this year's draft class gets compared to him quite a bit, and that's Jahmyr Gibbs. Analytically, Gibbs and Kamara are only kind of alike in that the receiving profiles were robust, but their total yards per team play rates were mostly average. Kamara's was actually pretty bad. But I don't think people realize how big Alvin Kamara actually is. He's 5'10", 214 pounds. Gibbs weighed in at 199 pounds. So he's a good 15 pounds lighter than Alvin Kamara. And while I don't think that weight was a surprise for Gibbs, given he was listed at 200 pounds in college, I do think that we should collectively take a deep breath and analyze Gibbs and his size profile objectively. To me, Gibbs wasn't really a winner or a loser at the combine per se, because I can find reasons that he won and I can find reasons that he lost. I just think that he's the kind of player that we should be talking about post-combine because there's lots of fantasy football implications here. The bad news is that Gibbs weighed in under 200 pounds. He was 199 pounds. In my prospect models database, I've got every running back who either went to the combine or who was drafted since 2011. Of the running backs who were under 200 pounds, none of them were able to have a season of 15 or more PPR points per game across their first 3 seasons in the league. The only 2 who were decent were Andre Ellington and Tariq Cohen. They didn't exactly have long careers. Gibbs is sort of an outlier though, because he's a small running back and also projected to get drafted high. So let's say that he goes in the top 50. Running backs who weighed less than 210 pounds and were drafted in the top 50 since 2011 include Christian McCaffrey, Ronald Jones, Giovanni Bernard, David Wilson, Isaiah Pead, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. That's not great. And it's not like I'm trying to prove a point here with this arbitrary top 50 cutoff. When you look at the top 100, here are the running backs who get added to that list. Duke Johnson, Tevin Coleman, Amir Abdullah, Bishop Sankey, Jerick McKinnon, Trey Mason, Ronnie Hillman, LaMichael James, Devin Singletary, J.K. Dobbins, Darrell Henderson, Darrington Evans, and James Cook. If you're completely ignoring Jahmyr Gibbs' weight, you're not looking at things objectively. Whether we agree with it or not, NFL teams give bigger-bodied running backs more volume. Now, the reason that you could see Gibbs as a winner is because you already knew that he was small. You already knew that he was going to be around 200 pounds. And technically, he was shorter than expected. That raised his BMI, which is a good thing. And he also tested well athletically and had a strong speed score. Again, something we really want to see with a running back who's smaller. Gibbs is my model's RB2 right now. And he's the RB2 in my rankings too. But let's not sit back and assume that this is a flawless prospect for fantasy purposes. That's the thing. He could very well end up being more valuable in real football than fantasy football. But the weight thing matters. And it's not like he's this unique player from that perspective. We've seen good draft capital from running backs who are smaller. It hasn't happened very frequently, but we've seen it. And the results have not been great. Now, speaking of running back size, let's talk about Zach Evans. If you listen to the episode on running backs who produce like studs in college, then you heard me say some bad things about Zach Evans' production profile. Now, he did play with other NFL caliber running backs in college, but his marks across the board were pretty bad. Evans had a chance to look okay in the model, though, if he was drafted early. He seemed to have the size that we all desire for fantasy football running backs. He was listed at 215 pounds in college after once being listed at 195. So if he was 215, he could be seeing big workloads in the NFL. And then the NFL Combine happened. And Evans, who didn't even run his 40, weighed in at 202 pounds. If he slimmed down for the 40, that would make more sense, but he didn't even run it. So I think he's going to be dropping in rankings as a result. Now, the last thing to touch on today is the tight end class. I don't have a tight end model because it's very hard to prospect them for fantasy purposes. What has gotten signal for me in the past is height-adjusted speed score, athleticism, and draft capital. And this class has it all. NFLMockDraftDatabase.com has 6 tight ends projected to go in the top 100 right now. So the draft capital would be there. Of those 6, all but Dalton Kincaid ran the 40. And we all know Kincaid is one of the best prospects in the class. But of the other 5, each one of them had a height-adjusted speed score above 103, which is like the 75th percentile. Darnell Washington's was in the 97th percentile. So we have good prospects, and these prospects are also athletic. It's an unbelievable tight end class, so if you've got a tight end needy team, which most of us have, it's a good one for you. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Check out lateround.com, pre-order that prospect guide. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later in the week with the Mailbag Show.